Hello, Satanico here once again with Godlovescomics and another edition of Strange Ones. This is Strange Ones Part 2, if that's not contradictory, and essentially it's just another small batch of random number one comics I have in my collection, not particularly valuable. Some may be a little bit valuable, but for the most part not. And we'll try to race through these relatively quickly. I always say that and then drag it out to an hour. But let's start off with this one. This is Iron Fist number 1 from the second volume of Iron Fist, 1996. Pretty surprised I bought this, just because I don't even think I was buying any new comics at this point in time. But I think I really like the cover. I must have stumbled across it somewhere. It seems to be by Robert Brown and Ray Garcia. And as far as I can tell, there was only 2 issues of this, which is kind of surprising. Of course, Iron Fist became somewhat of a hot property again with the new Netflix series, and then people discovered that they hated the new Netflix series, and there was a lot of the sort of phony baloney whitewashing argument that came from a lot of misguided, politically correct idiots. And so I haven't watched the series, so I have no idea whether it's any good or not, but I haven't heard anything good about it. I don't really care either way. I've watched almost none of the Netflix series, but anyway, I like the cover. It seemed like it was very good art. I have no idea what Robert Brown and Ray Garcia are up to now, but anyway, that's Iron Fist number 1. Here's something I can attest to really loving, and this is Superman, All-Star Superman number 1 by Frank Quitely, and with Jamie Grant, and of course written by Grant Morrison. And I'm a big Frank Quitely fan. Grant Morrison sometimes is hit and miss, but he's a brilliant writer. I mean, he's a very, very talented writer. And this was probably, from my perspective, the best Superman story I've ever read. And I've never been a huge Superman fan. He's always been way too overpowered. He's always been pretty bland. They've always had artists that were unexciting, to say the least, when you're talking about Kurt Swan, Kurt Schaffenberger. And, you know, Superman was just a book that was just always there. It's an iconic character and a book that you know, are happy exists, but not one that anyone was particularly compelled to read on a monthly basis. This particular issue and it's just a mini series. So once again, I'm cheating a little bit by having a number 1. It's not like number 1 from an, you know, comic that's been running for 300 issues. But it was just, I thought it was brilliant. It finally gave some idea and some direction of how to do Superman, and in a way that hasn't been repeated a million times, even though it has a retro feel. And Frank Quitely is such an incredibly talented and versatile artist that he did what I said was heroin chic in sort of the first book that I became aware of him in, which was 2020 Visions, and then he does this incredibly wholesome, you know, handsome Superman with a very much a retro feel in this series. And it's just a great book, great series, and highly recommended, and not expensive at all. This is a nice book to have. Warlock number 1, 20 cents. It's not his first appearance, of course, and so it's not terribly valuable. And this particular issue is not in great shape. It's got a crease up here, it's got a little bit of stress here, it's got a lot of stress along the spine, it's got a lot of stress at the bottom, it's got a crease down here, so it's probably in good to very good at best. I would say good. And so it's not, you know, it's mostly a reader's copy, but I bought it primarily for the Gil Kane cover, Gil Kane art, and, you know, it's a couple of bucks, so it was certainly worth buying. And I think Gil Kane said that he was kind of doing all the number 1s, or a lot of the sort of debut comics of Marvel back in this period, and so I believe I'm not sure if he continued doing the series or not. It seems like I've seen a few more issues of this which were done by Gil Kane, but I'm not positive now. I think I have a couple of the at least one of the earlier issues, and it was also Gokane, but I'm not sure. Okay, and this is Camelot 3000, number 1. Another little bit of a cheat, considering it's only one of 12 maxi series, but from the Bronze Age. Most of these comics are from the Bronze Age, with just a couple of modern. And this was a great series at the time, particularly. It was pretty groundbreaking at the time for mainstream comics. It was almost as close to, I would say, a Vertigo series, because it actually had a sliver of nudity and suggestions of lesbianism and, you know, some of the things that you would expect in Vertigo, but at the time were completely anathema to, you know, mainstream comics, particularly at DC, which was the most conservative, and at Marvel as well. And but this was done by Mike W. Barr, and of course you can see that beautiful cover is by Brian Bolland, and all of the interior art for all 12 issues was by Brian Bolland. If I'm correct, it seems like the final issue, there was a long delay in it coming out. I'm not sure if it was because he was behind on the art chores or whatever. Don't remember what the story was related to that at the moment, but it was a really entertaining book, a really entertaining storyline, and I'm surprised it wasn't. I think it was a pretty big success, but I really can attest to that for sure. And it continues to be a very, very cheap book, and which is kind of surprising also, because Brian Bolland is such a great artist, and you know, was one of the premier cover artists for DC at the time. But really the best example of Brian Bolland, not the best example of his artwork, but the best example of a collectible related to his work is The Killing Joke, which is, of course, the famous Alan Moore Batman story. This is Alien Worlds, number 1, from Pacific Comics, I do believe. And this is a cover by Chiodo. I think it's Joe Chiodo, sort of in the I want to say Richard Corbin, but not really Richard Corbin. It was kind of the what's his name? Boris Vallejo. Sort of the Boris Vallejo style, who in a lot of ways was sort of a less aesthetically pleasing but technically skilled Frank Frazetta sort of rip-off artist, which isn't really a fair assessment, but, you know, that's kind of what he falls under. But I bought this primarily. It's got a nice cover, no doubt about that. I bought it because of Al Williamson, as always, and also Bruce Jones is in there. This might be Tim Conrad, Val Mayrick, Nestor Redondo, all very good artists, but Al Williamson was the primary goal. And but it's not one of Al Williamson's best works. It's kind of just run-of-the-mill Williamson, if there's such a thing, and so it wasn't, you know, terribly satisfying. I think the interiors are black and white as well, which is fine. Al Williamson looks fantastic in black and white. This is Star Trek number 1 from the Bronze Age once again. Steve Leialoha cover, which I was never the biggest fan of his work. It was always kind of this sort of watery sort of stuff, but so I wasn't that thrilled with this comic when it came out. Looking at it now, I'm just happy. It's in nice shape. It's got a little blunt at the corner, and that's about it, but not really particularly valuable. As you can see, it's Star Trek the Motion Picture, so it's really initiated by the first motion picture, which was the least successful. And if I'm correct, I think this series did not run very long, and I'm not sure if Marvel came out with a Star Trek related, you know, adaptation of The Wrath of Khan, which is kind of funny and kind of sad, because the first Star Trek movie just got critically panned. It was just too convoluted and a little bit boring and strange and not particularly action-packed, and it lacked some of the character interactions that really make Star Trek click. And so, unfortunate that this series would end before The Wrath of Khan would come out, and that was everything that critics wanted, everything that the hardcore Star Trek fans wanted, and like I said, I'm not sure if Marvel did an adaptation of that. They may have, but not that I recall. This is American Flag number 1, and this is by Howard Chaykin. It's probably one of Chaykin's best works. It's, you know, relatively independent. I mean, it's her first comics. He looked like he was given pretty much complete control. He wrote it, fully illustrated it, and it was a very, very interesting series. It had talking cats in it, long before Saga came out with Lion Cat. It had a lot of political undertones, as you can see back in the USA. A lot of these, a lot of sort of almost pseudo-fascist, almost pseudo-communistic overtones in the illustration, but related to America. Of course, his name is Reuben Flagg. I can't remember that much particularly about the story now. I just remember being really impressed with it for probably the first year or so, and then it seemed to sort of tail off, or I started to lose interest in it. But this was among Chaykin's best sort of artistic work, and some of his best writing. I don't recall him much as a writer as much as an artist. I mean, he worked on Star Wars, he worked on Indiana Jones, he worked on stuff like that, and he also worked on Black Hawks and a very erotic, maybe even porn related comic called Black Kiss, which I just remember reading reviews. I've never seen it, but I think American Flag is one of his better works by far. Okay, this is a classic. Black Panther #1. And I feel like Black Panther and the Eternals were Jack Kirby's last best work before he kind of faded. I think in the first episode of Strange Ones, I talked about Machine Man and Devil Dinosaur, which both came out at the same time, and Black Panther and the Eternals essentially came out at the same time as well. And they were vastly superior, I think, to those other two latter books, which Kirby was sort of fading on. This is in really nice shape. Got a little bit of a crease along, not even crease, a little bit of bending from just a slight misalignment in the cover. But otherwise, almost no flaws, except maybe a couple of tiny ticks, tiny color breaks on the spine, and maybe a little more blunting in the corner, but very nice copy. Beautiful art in the series, for the most part. There's some crazy stuff. There's this frog is the central aspect of the plot in the first couple of issues, and it is actually a time machine, so King Solomon's Frog, so kind of thing that he's back as only Jack Kirby can do it, and indeed it's completely Jack Kirby insanity. And it was kind of a weird period as well, because Jack Kirby, I think this was the period where Kirby was already in California, and so I think the letters page and everything was addressed to him in California. But yeah, so it was one of his better things in the latter stage of his career, and obviously created a nice new mythology. And that's Doctor Strange. Again, not his first appearance. His first appearance was in one of these anthology books that escapes my name at the moment, which hardcore fans would laugh at. This is a Frank Bruner cover. Interestingly, I was looking at a critic friend's page on Comic Art Fans a few days ago, and he has a pretty extensive, really beautiful collection of original art. And I was looking at one of his pieces that he owns, which is a David Mazzucchelli splash page from Daredevil's Born Again series. And I also saw that he had recently purchased a incredible page by Frank Bruner, one of the best pages I've ever seen from Frank Bruner. And as you can see, this cover, Frank Bruner was really in vogue at this period of time because, you can see all the detail, the sort of zipatone background, but he had a really beautiful page. This is also a really nice page, and Bruner did really good work at this time, and it was pretty hot. And of course, the successful movie coming out always makes these things a little bit hotter. But this copy's not in particularly great shape. It's probably fine at best, maybe not even. Obviously, it's a little bit misaligned. You can see a little bit of spine roll here, and where you can actually see the staples, which should be on the side. But and a lot of stress right down in the far corner. But anyway, this is Elektra Assassin cheating again because it's only an 8-issue limited series. What can I say? I've only got so many number ones in my collection. This is Bill Sienkiewicz, of course. Bill Sienkiewicz at, I would say, almost his most experimental, but there's no such thing as most experimental for Bill Sienkiewicz because he is an absolute genius. He can draw any way you possibly want him to draw. He's drawn very conventional issues for Fantastic Four and obviously Moon Knight, and then he went absolutely crazy on New Mutants and Elektra Assassin and other stuff. He was, famously the big numbers debacle with Alan Moore, which was then turned over to Al Columbia, and that's a whole long story that you can read in the Comics Interpreter. But anyway, beautiful cover. Really interesting series. Sometimes a little too overlooked. I think it's a little too esoteric for most people. But written by Frank Miller, illustrated by Bill Sienkiewicz. That cover is dated 1986. And you might want to take a look at Elektra Assassin. And here is Invaders #1. And I am not positive who did this cover. It looks sort of like Sal Buscema. The thing is that in several of the early Invaders covers were done by Jack Kirby. And I saw an interview with Roy Thomas on YouTube in which he was specifically talking at a convention about how he talked Jack Kirby into contributing to the Invaders in any way possible, so he was able to kind of cajole Jack to do the covers. But then the interior art is done by Frank Robbins, and it's always that bait and switch that I talk about with seeing a Kirby cover and then as a kid sort of opening up and seeing Frank Robbins art, which was completely different than anything else Marvel had going on at the time. Frank Robbins, kind of a Milton Caniff acolyte. And interestingly enough, I was not aware that Frank Robbins wrote so many episodes of so many issues of Detective Comics back during the sort of classic Neil Adams cover period. And so you would see Frank Robbins as a writer and sometimes the interior artist as well under Neil Adams covers. And then sometimes Frank Robbins was writing scripts also with Gil Kane. So Gil Kane illustrations. So that was interesting. I wasn't aware of that. And I actually like the work now. He did a Man-Bat issue. He did a lot of Detective Comics issues kind of in the very end of the Silver Age, very cusp of the Bronze Age, around 1969, 1970. Interestingly, I haven't properly bagged this one, and this gives you a good idea of what I was just talking about. See, this cover, which is pretty run-of-the-mill, pretty unspectacular. Like I said, it looks a little bit like a Sal Buscema to me, but I'm not positive. And then this is Kirby, and that's #3. I had them in the same bag, so in the same board, so I was economizing with those. I don't think those issues are in the best of shape. The first one has a little bit of soiling. This one actually looks really nice, and yeah, so I actually like this cover, of course, better than #1, but that's no surprise. This is Shogun Warriors #1, and classic sort of Herb Trimpe, who's probably best known for The Incredible Hulk. Not one of my favorite comics, and in fact, really pretty disappointing. I had some of the Shogun Warriors, the giant, they were at least 12 inches. It seems like they're 14-inch figures. I have one of them, Radon, I guess. I'm not sure which one. Yeah, I don't remember exactly which one, but I sold it to a collector in Germany for, I think, about $80. Had to ship it to Germany. That was fine. It's just a big, ugly plastic thing. And the comic itself, Herb Trimpe did this. He also did Godzilla. Both were pretty disappointing, but looking at them, I didn't like them at the time as a kid. It was in 1978. But looking back at them now, you see more charm in Trimpe's work and everything else, but still not a series I have any particular affection for. And pretty run-of-the-mill generic cover as far as I'm concerned. But this is certainly not run-of-the-mill or generic. I've talked about this, I think, in another episode, one of my haul videos, but this is Blade Runner #1 by Al Williamson and Carlos Garzon, and adapted from the movie, of course, by Archie Goodwin. And just beautiful, beautiful cover. look at all the beautiful detail in the building and everything. Great likeness of Harrison Ford, of course, and just beautiful. It's beautifully illustrated inside. Some of Al Williamson's best work, but I rave about Al Williamson all the time when it comes to the Blade Runner adaptation, the Empire Strikes Back adaptation, the Return of the Jedi adaptation, and even the Flash Gordon adaptation, which I'll have to show at a later point. But yeah, beautiful work. Of course, there's a new Blade Runner movie coming out. Unfortunately, even though it has Ryan Gosling in it, which is fine, and also has Harrison Ford in it, which is great. It also has Jared Leto in it, which is always a bad sign. That's almost a death knell for any movie that has Jared Leto in it, because he's just grotesque as far as I'm concerned. Especially if you've heard his band, which is beyond horrible. But anyway, Blade Runner, the adaptation is as beautiful as the movie, which the movie is a classic now. And this is Tales of Teen Titans, New Teen Titans, number 1 of 4. Again, just a mini-series, but Cyborg and George Perez. I think what was interesting about this mini-series to me, in retrospect, is that it was all done by George Perez, but they had a multitude of, well, not a multitude, as many as, I think, 3 or 4 different inkers on each series. I'm not sure if this one was Romeo Tangal, who was his typical inker, and or this may have been Gene Day. And Gene Day's fantastic artist, obviously died in his early 30s, way too young. Mostly best known for Master of Kung Fu, but anyway, this is really nice cover, nice work. If you were into New Teen Titans at the time, you know, it's pretty cool. I'm surprised that this isn't a bigger, a more valuable issue, but it's not the first appearance of Cyborg or anything like that. But maybe it will become more valuable with the JLA movie, and Cyborg is now a member of the JLA because of they needed some diversity. And so, I don't know. It doesn't really matter. I bought it at the time just for the Perez art. And down to the last 2. This is a number 1 that's only a one-shot anyway. There is a DC version as well, and this was done, as it says, all proceeds from this comic book are being donated to famine relief and recovery in Africa. This was 1985 in terms of the cover. That's an Arthur Adams cover. And I'll show the next comic, and then we'll go and take a real quick look into this comic, because it is jam-packed with the most famous artists of the Bronze Age. Like any kind of anthology, you see the names and you kind of drool, and then you see the art and it's all, you know, or the story or whatever, and it's not really too much of a good thing. It's just that you're not seeing the best work from all of these artists as much as you would hope so. But in this case, I think you do see some really beautiful artwork. I mean, obviously the cover's really nice. I do believe Stephen King wrote a page in this, and a lot of some famous writers and pretty much every famous artist of the Bronze Age, because obviously it was for a good cause. It was essentially comics' own version of Live Aid during the terrible famine in Africa. One of many, but this was one of the most noteworthy at the time and got probably the most press. So we'll take a look at that in just a minute inside. And this is the last issue, and it is Inhumans, and I'm very, very sad by this issue because there is some kind of crazy scuffing. I'm not sure how I had this, if I had this bagged properly or bagged at all, and it almost seems like some of the ink almost looks like a misprint, but it's just scuffed right across the red of the cover. And that's unfortunate, because otherwise it looks like a really good copy, really good issue. That's a Gil Kane cover, fairly certain, and I believe Gil Kane interior art. It doesn't really get much better in Gil Kane. And Inhumans number 1, I really like the series. I'm surprised it wasn't more successful. The first 7 or 8 issues were, I think, by Gil Kane, beautifully illustrated. Really well done with the characters, and probably some of their best handling of the characters since at least the early Lee Kirby days. And of course, this is another book that now has a TV series attached to it, which if you had told me that the Inhumans was going to be in a TV series, I would have been shocked. And it looks like a really terrible TV series in terms of makeup, costuming, effects, design, acting, writing. Every aspect of it looks absolutely god awful. And but I haven't seen it. I'm talking from just the previews, so I may be completely wrong, and if somebody loves it, that's fine. I would love it to be better than it is, but regardless, that TV series is probably not going to do wonders for the book, but it's a really good book with, I don't remember anything about the story, but I just remember Gil Kane art, which I always like. So let's take a quick look at the Heroes for Hope, because it is really filled with a who's who of art. Of artists from the time period, and it's actually a pretty thick book. I don't know if you can see there, for just a normal pamphlet comic with saddle stitch. It's really nice shape. Yeah, it's in really nice shape. Pretty close to near mint. So, see if we can read any of these. Well, if you can, I can read them to you though. So first of all, you've got Stan Lee writing pages 1 and 2 and pages 3 and 4. Then you've got various people. Louise Simonson. Stephen King wrote page 10 and through 12. And that's penciled by Bernie Wrightson and inked by Jeff Jones. So it doesn't really get any better than that. Bernie Wrightson with Stephen King. Of course, I think they've worked together on, or they did work together on various adaptations of King's, books, but still, it's pretty awesome that they got together for this. Plus Bill Mantlo with Charlie Vess and John J. Muth, which is also excellent. Brent Anderson and Tom Palmer. Alan Moore working with Richard Corbin. I'm not always the biggest Richard Corbin fan, but that's a pretty cool collaboration. Ann Nocenti with Michael Kaluta and Al Milgrom. Harlan Ellison with Frank Miller and Bill Sienkiewicz. Chris Claremont with Brian Bolin, who we just talked about, and Craig Russell. Joe Duffy with John Bolton, and John Bolton's fantastic. Mike Barron with Steve Rude, one of his old collaborators. Denny O'Neil with Brett Blevins, and inked by Al Williamson, so that's awesome as well. George Martin. I'm not sure if that's George R.R. Martin or not. I don't recall that. But that could be George R.R. Martin before he became famous, but I'm not sure. With Herb Trimpe, who we just talked about in terms of doing the Shogun Warriors, and Sal Buscema, not really the best art team. Bruce Jones with Gray Morrow. Gray Morrow was a fantastic artist. Steve Englehart with Paul Gulacy. Paul Gulacy and Bob Layton. Paul Gulacy was best known for Master of Kung Fu. Bob Layton was best known for Iron Man. Jim Shooter with Alan Weiss and Joe Rubinstein, great inker. Mike Grell from Warlord, writing with Jackson Geist, who also goes by Butch Geist, and Steve Leialoha, who we just saw did the cover for Star Trek #1. And finally, Archie Goodwin with Howard Chaykin, who we just saw do the American flag, and Walt Simonson. So that's pretty amazing. Also, that all the sort of crossover of the #1, the artists I was mentioning on all of those #1s, and the fact that so many of them actually are present in this book as well. And it says Heroes for Hope, story by Claremont, Nocenti, Bernie Wrightson, Jim Starlin, and Jim Shooter. Pretty cool. So, and this first page, I guess, is by John Romita Jr., who probably was a hot artist at the time because he was doing X-Men. Let's see if we can look for page 10 to 12 and see the Stephen King, Bernie Wrightson. And there we go, right there. Stephen King and Bernie Wrightson. Which, as I said, might not blow you away. And sometimes the work doesn't quite add up to the weight of the names that are attached to it. But it still looks like really nice work, of course, by Bernie Wrightson. It's only Stephen King writing 2 pages. There you go, right there. Page 13 is by Charlie Vess and John J. Muth. 2 superb artists right here. And page, let's see what else. Okay, let's look at 16 to 18, which is Alan Moore and Richard Corbin. And it's unusual to see Richard Corbin's art even in a pamphlet comic or on newsprint. His work doesn't really translate very well to newsprint because it's so detailed with all these weird sort of stippling that he does. And so it's pretty interesting. I do not remember the story at all, or don't remember his art even. Some really nice art there. It's maybe Brett Blevins and Williamson, but I'm not positive. What page is that? 20? Oh, Michael Kaluta, inked by Al Milgram. So that's really nice. That doesn't even look like Kaluta particularly to me, but that's what the key says. And let's see what else we have real quick. Let's look at Harlan Ellison with Frank Miller on page 22 through 24. As inked by Bill Sienkiewicz. Is that right there? That's Frank Miller art. And some Harlan Ellison writing. And Logan, the man faces Wolverine. This is how it was for you long before Hudson found you in the forest of the Canadian Rockies, Logan. The voice is soft, feral, menacing. Try reading that in Harlan Ellison's very distinctive voice. Always pretty entertaining. Frank Miller back at Wolverine. And let's see if I can find one more interesting one. Let's look at 25 and 26, Chris Claremont and Brian Bolin. That's page 26. A little bit of Storm fan service there, and a little bit of Storm bondage, but it's just kind of a dream sequence or some kind of thing where she's, you know, some kind of manipulated telepathic thing that they constantly did in X-Men, as her face melts off at the end. And finally, let's look at see Bruce Jones and Gray Morrow on 36 and 37. There we go. Beautifully drawn by Gray Morrow. You don't see him doing very many superhero comics. He was kind of like Mike Ploog. I mean, he did like a lot of supernatural stuff, and didn't really make the transition to the superhero stuff too much. I mean, I think he did some Man-Thing, stuff like that, but actually really beautifully drawn. And they, of course, incorporate the whole aspect. You have Rogue. What you see here apparently is one of these starving children touching Rogue and transfers. You know, she, of course, is more than empathetic. She adapts people's powers, so I guess it causes her great pain to feel someone dying, which is pretty well done. Here's the back cover. And a little more art. So, there's a nice page there as well. So actually, really a feast for the eyes, the X-Men Heroes for Hope. And that's actually, again, a comic, despite all of these great artists, Arthur Adams, and I've already listed off all the others, is, I think, very, very cheap, very easy to pick up. You can probably pick up a near mint copy, if there are any, or certainly a very fine copy for $3 or $4 at the most, probably. So, kind of unfortunate that the key issues are related primarily to, or the value of comics are related primarily to key issues, and of course the movie appearances, and not so much the quality of the art, or even it shouldn't really be related to the sort of ethical impetus of the story, but just the art alone and the number of writers in this makes it a really interesting comic, and certainly far more interesting than many of the movie-related comics that people go gaga for. So anyway, that's the second edition of Strange Ones. There may not be a third edition because I don't have too many number ones in my collection, as I've said before. And I'll be back next time with some more comics related to something else. I have no idea yet. But thanks for watching, and by all means, please subscribe and like, comment, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Thanks. Goodbye.